Hello everyone, today we talk about encastellation and more in general the reorganization of territorial powers in post-Carolingian Europe. Um, I already talked about encastellation and made a video in the early days, let's say, which is still this year by the way, about which I don't remember the name, in which I offer a bit of an introduction to encastellation, even though the video wasn't specifically only about that. It was Alodia, encastellation, and noble families in post-Carolingian Europe. So yeah, I definitely gave, however, a broad picture of the topic. So if you wanna go look at that, that can provide a very good introduction, at least to what I'm discussing now, because it's a sort of continuation of it. So first of all, I spent another word about encastellation, which surely I did already in the let's say in the other video, but encastellation is not a term you often hear. I've googled it. It exists in English. It's definitely used historiographically speaking, but it's one of those rare words that come up, every once in a while. There are historiographical reasons for this, partly because the encastellation we're discussing today, it's a moment in the history into which, let's say, it was more developed and pronounced in certain regions of Europe. It actually happened also in England, because this is the moment in which also the Britain is invested by the Viking invasions, let's say, but it's something that really, that is, and this is the point. It is often associated with this idea that the second invasions, however, were the main cause of encastellation. True and false at the same time, meaning that to me it's not really the first reason, at least in average European terms, in the sense that it's been showed by many studies, many prominent scholars, that in certain areas of Europe, actually the greatest part of Europe, the encastellation wasn't really born out of the second invasions. Those helped strengthen it, but really the first cause of encastellation was the need for local aristocracies to build seigneurial dominions around. And what you see, in fact, that the major castles that were built often were built in areas that, first of all, suffered very few, I can say, this is also generalization, but let's say that there is evidence of regions that were first invaded, say, by either the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Saracens, and were maybe too poor to build castles. Then castles were built after those guys had been defeated or went away. This is the case, for instance, of the Roman countryside around Rome, and encastellation starts in there, actually at the end of the Saracen incursions, when the nobles began to have more wealth, to have more resources, and to start building their own private domains. And generally speaking, the second invasions are not something that lasts forever. Especially they're not something that lasts forever in the majority of continental Europe, so the European mainland, that was definitely the area that saw the greatest development of encastellation. We're talking chiefly about France, Italy, and parts of Germany. And you see in there that the sheer quantity of castles were built at the time doesn't evidently correspond to the Viking or Magyar Saracens incursions that were albeit very destructive. However, first of all, they didn't hit certain areas where castles developed, and secondly, they were relatively episodic. So you see by studying the local society, local politics, that these lords were building castles basically on their own, for their own at their own personal benefit, more than for strictly defensive needs. And this is also something that you see because castles were usually built in areas that could control the countryside. And the castles instead were built because of the raids of the enemy raids. By the way, could be even the ones of the local, let's say, of the local nobility. I mean, definitely, if you consider all the warfare was taking place at that time, kind of made even in defensive terms, kind of made more sense to build a castle to defend from your neighbor, that was trying to build the lordships on his own, than for defending from an incursion that could happen, I don't know, every relatively few times compared to the whole time spectrum. And secondly, I was saying that the castles that were built for the sake of these incursions were often smaller, were structures that were built for emergential reasons into areas that had a particular strategic significance along the ways, like mountain passes or other obliged points of passage, that when the raids ended were abandoned, because it's evident that those were not meant to last. While the whole structural thing about encapsulation lays its base on the castles built by the local lords for their own, let's say, patrimonial strategies. Mm. So this is very important to bear in mind, and this doesn't mean to minimize the importance of the second invasions in the constructions of castles, because this definitely happened. But it didn't happen in the same, let's say, everywhere in the same ways. And this is very important to bear in mind. And today, usually, I'm a great supporter of the narrative that, I mean, I'm pretty neutral to the thing, because I know that things are varied, but I like to tell that really this often catastrophic picture, the second invasions that brought the whole Europe to be encastled, is something that evidently doesn't hold, even theoretically, as even let's say abstractly as a theory. However, today we will also try to give a look to those areas where, in fact, encapsulation was mainly caused by the second invasions. So the were indeed, we're talking essentially about the 9th and 10th centuries now. So those were centuries indeed of instability, of continuous dangers, of the necessity of defense. And the main reason why this was happening, however, was that instability was given by the collapse of the public institutions. The Carolingian Empire had managed to essentially control this huge area of Europe that I think until Napoleon nobody else was able to to cover once again into Europe, and that at a certain point collapsed, and it didn't just collapse, but it collapsed because the same Carolingians began to slaughter each other, and because the Carolingian administration was definitely a very decentralized, so it favored the emergence of various powers that weren't at all interested into into having a strong public authority minding their own business. I made it. Basically, I've got a Carolingian Europe playlist that with 12 videos that essentially deal almost exclusively on this. I mean, on the reasons why Carolingian society was essentially this paradox of a public world, say, with a public authority, let's say, that however was private in nature. And there are many reasons. I won't be explaining them. There's plenty of videos in the Carolingian Europe playlist. Go check that out if you're interested, because I answer more than exhaustively to that question, and I will keep doing that, because I think it's very important in practice. So let's say that there were many let's say let's say, empty parts of the empire, certain a vacuum that was filled with organisms that had a sort of spontaneous push towards expansion. This is normally how what society, human society, do. I mean, where they can't cease, they will do it because that's really how the whole international politics, how the whole um, state of relations practically are. This was happening from the essentially from the Carolingian, same Carolingian aristocracy. So these aristocrats, as we've seen many times in our videos, were essentially entrusted a huge quantity of land by the Carolingians, and that was the system through which the Carolingians built their own empire. And that center of power was that land was really the center of power in the sense that it was chiefly meant not just as an administrative representation, but rather as a recruitment center, because all the land that these nobles were given to by the king were essentially meant to provide troops for the army, because really the Carolingian Empire remained in shape, remained standing as long as as it was expanding military campaign after military campaign every single year. So in this sense, when the public structures that were much weaker than these local lordships began to collapse, these local powers were essentially very strong centers in their own regard. I mean, they had definitely, it was still a very fluid and stable situation for which there were many nobles that got, I don't know, destroyed by others and all. But generally speaking, was a very marked, especially military potential into these centers that, however, was still political, economical, and originated to very strong lordships that eventually emerged at a certain point as the leading powers of post-Carolingian Europe. This is the case of, I don't know, of the Ottonians in Germany, of many other local powers in Italy. France had a relatively, it was so fragmented that before there were certain nuclei, well-defined nuclei rising from, let's say, the ashes of the Western Frankish kingdom. It would take a bit longer, but there were also very strong powers in there at this time, and the let's say that the how did these powers rose? We also discussed that in the Carolingian. I've got videos, but also perhaps there is something also in medieval society, in the medieval society's playlist, relatively to the origin of feudalism, that is very important and very strongly interconnected with the collapse of the Carolingian Europe. So I please check that out. I'm not just saying that because it's my videos. I'm saying it because I really explained that in there, and it's something relatively complex, not extremely complicated. Can be complicated in part, especially when you get to jurisdictions and all. But it's relatively once you get the let's say the pattern, how those dynamics work. It's easy actually to even to explain by yourself how things worked at the time. But let's say that we'll repeat it very synthetically. Essentially, this seigneurial power that emerged from post-Carolingian Europe was essentially backed not just by the force of arms, that, as we've seen, was one of the characteristics of the post-Carolingian aristocracy, but it was also legitimized by the fact that the same lords had assumed by themselves, because there was no public authority often that could do that otherwise, the, the task of defending the inhabitants of a certain city, certain region, I mean a certain community in general, in exchange for their say their loyalty, their fealty in a certain way. So this translated in turn to very I mean we're discussing this as if it was theoretically as if it was a sort of social contract with more or less the same power from both sides, but it wasn't really like this, and the more time went on, the more the feudal aristocracy indeed gained power over the communities. But really the emergential nature of post-Carolingian European environment in terms of political, military and social organization had brought the lords to acquire this role. And if you take, especially from a juridical point of view, until the French Revolution, basically the whole Ancien Regime history was based on this, juridically speaking. There were rights that were formed at a certain point, at an X point in early medieval Europe. Could be either from the very first days of the Germans that arrived, could be, especially in this period, actually in post-Carolingian Europe, where these seigneuries had been born. Some came later because there were cities and other communities raising together, popping up next to the feudal domains that also developed their own prerogatives. They fought for them. So essentially, this was the idea that those prerogatives were historically recognized and respected by even by the state that was formed in the modern age, because that was the idea. It's as if those rights had been innate. So if you wanted to take them away, from the local communities, for instance, for the sake of centralization, you still had to give something in exchange for that. And this is how really the modern state was born. Sometimes the modern state simply had a certain point it gets really the upper end, so it began to eventually with Napoleon, this juridically speaking it's evident, because at a certain point the state takes everything in terms of rights and decides, and it's the only source of rights. Before it wasn't like that, but essentially this is the moment in the early Middle Ages in which that had begun, in spite of all the transformations that occurred even during the same Ancien Regime history. But this was the idea. You can rule because you are legitimized by the communities. It's a pure contract. And it couldn't be otherwise, because this was a stateless world. Roman law was at this time especially practically forgotten. It was mostly a society of Germanic traditions, so juridically speaking it functioned in the sense that everybody was free, and therefore there wasn't a guy who was freer than another and that could impose its own prestige. There was nobility, but nobility was still a matter of prestige, of authority, based on the personal wealth, not really because they were juridically superior. Aside from the serfs that obviously had this half-free or non-free status. So, but if you wanted to, among freemen, to determine these kind of contracts, you were free to do it. Historically speaking, however, the reality was that the nobility progressively made even freemen, in this sense, subjugated in losing even de facto their own freedom. So that you arrive at the height of the peak of, let's say, of feudal Europe, in a situation in which, even if you are a freeman, you don't have any real freedom in practice, because you can't really find any other place to go working, unless, well, this also should be, it's also an approximation, because telling the truth, new centers rose. Excuse me, I drink a little. There were even many serfs that managed to gain freedom and all, but generally speaking, the more you go on, especially in the modern age, at the end of the, say, in the late Middle Ages and modern age, you see that the average peasant, doesn't matter where he was free or not, was still, juridically speaking, he was still increasingly more tied to the land. But this is not important. We have to talk about encastellation. And so we start with two examples, really, not really talking about castles, but how it happened, really, that in this very tormented situation, post-Carolingian Europe, or the end, late Carolingian Europe with civil wars and the second invasions, certain seigneuries were practically born. Let's take two French examples that are very meaningful. First of all, the one of Le Mans. Le Mans is in the Loire Valley, so one of the South Atlantic region, and one of the most hit, by the way, by the Vikings, who weren't just pillaging the coasts, but especially coming up to the rivers. I mean, through up to the Loire. They arrived even into Clermont, basically close to the Massif Central, in a very central area, a very continental, mountainous area of France, by just sailing up the Loire River and pillaging all around. So these were areas that were also relatively marginal to the real center of power of the Carolingians. It was instead in northeastern France, Belgium, the westernmost area of Germany. So Le Mans was relatively frontier area, abandoned by a bit by local central power. So what happened is that the citizens of Le Mans, in order to protect themselves from the Norman incursions, had obliged their own bishop, the Bishop of Le Mans, that up to that point had been considered the governor of the city, in absence of the public power, to essentially cede part of his power essentially to a band of adventurers, of armed adventurers, whose chief, Roger, would have become the Count of Maine. The figure is very disputed. We don't know where he came from, because, by the way, now there weren't just Norman adventurers in this situation. There were even French adventurers at this time, because when public authority collapses, everybody starts doing what they want. So even the whole thing about Vikings being martyrs and slaughtering and pillaging and all, completely true, but it was done basically by everyone else at the time. Obviously, continental Europe, even England, were a bit more civilized in the sense that it was, however, the idea of a public authority was there, when the Scandinavians didn't know that, because public authority, if anything, derived from the assemblies of the whole clans, so it was something very private in nature, even more than in the Carolingian world. So at least in continental Europe, it was the idea that there had to be a sort of pacification of public order. And you see here the role of bishops that is fundamental, because especially in the most urbanized area of Europe, here we are in northern France, that you had some urban center of importance, was held by the bishops, because those had been historically from the late antique period the guys that had a great social and political influence into the within the city walls, because the dioceses were there. So these bishops were there wasn't still the idea that ecclesiastics had to to be chaste, or I mean there was at least the theory, but the practice here, the the pretty average was that bishop was a normal nobleman married with concubines and all, even many children and all. And they were intermarried. They intermarried with the later aristocracies. Has it always been since the late antique and say the migration era period. So it's very meaningful that bishops in here are a sort of medium for this happen, for these into these difficult situations. It's interesting also that the citizens obliged the bishop, so it tells um, usually it was the other way around. I mean, it was the bishops who held enough power to determine how things had to work within the urban communities. Here, even if the situation is so desperate that the same citizens call for an adventurer to seize power. It's a sort of lordship. I mean, it's really how the lordship evolved historically speaking. This is how even the seigniories rose in Italy in the low Middle Ages. I mean, it's always the same reason. Chiefly a military need of protection. Then we make a step to the very other side of France, in the east, in the case of Langres. Langres is a French city on in the Marne region, essentially, and pretty close also to Germany. These were areas that were a bit more far away from the second invasions because they were in the very heart of continental Europe. So the Vikings didn't reach up easily to there, and were also fairly distant from the Magyar threat and the Saracen one. So they very continental environment, and in here instead it's the bishop himself that at the end of the 9th century takes the initiative to wall his city. And this is usually remembered in medieval history manuals because it's one of the evidences of the autonomization of local powers. And the Western Frankish king, so what would have later become the French king, to be more, to really understand what we're talking about, as a public authority was definitely out there because even in post-Carolingian times, the idea is that the public institutions still existed. Also because were quite profitable for these local aristocracies to seize them and to add power to their own political action. The king could do nothing in practice but recognizing the Bishop of Langres as first of all, if I don't remember badly, owner of the walls. I mean, he had built the walls, and obviously, surely the local citizenry had participated, but he had paid most for it. So the walls physically belonged to him. The walls, in this sense, were part of the many other rights that that lords could really have in these terms. What's a right in post-Carolingian? It's these things. I mean, it's the right of exacting tolls, for instance, for the guys that pass through those walls. It's all what derives from these patrimonial construction. And a Bishop of Langres, in this sense, was recognized also as the Lord of Langres in itself. So Langres is relatively distant from Paris, from which the very weak, let's say, the royal power at the time ruled. So what could the king do? The best thing was not to stop these initiatives that definitely in a normal situation would have not happened without the king's consent, because they were essentially allowing these local elites to autonomize in terms, because if you build a city wall, that's pretty even for the public authority to reach you, it's more difficult because if you want to disobey, you have walls behind which to hide. I mean, and defending yourself. So it's something that adds up to the political fragmentation. But at that point, for the kings, it was better to recognize these rights because that was a way to tie those elites to your legitimizing authority. Because if you had a right that was recognized by the king, that was something extraordinary, because nobody could touch it, basically, into this chaotic mess that Europe had become after the fall of the Carolingian Empire. And that was a way essentially to maintain a privileged relation between the central authority and the aristocracy. It didn't happen always in this way. There was a lot of infight. Essentially, all the aristocrats, let's say, um, the kings at this time were essentially struggling against other aristocrats in order to impose their own power. So all the wars that occurred at that time were always by aristocratic initiative. So it's very interesting to look at this dialectics, and it shows how, in this case, Encastellation was something that there was not even to need to wait for it underlines the spontaneity of Encastellation. Mm. That in a city like Langres wasn't happening directly because we're Vikings, or I don't know if Langres was hit by some ordeal of that kind, but the importance here is that there was a local aristocrat who wanted to strengthen its own domain on the city, on the surrounding territory. And this is how really Encastellation um, was carried out in practice. Um, Looking instead at Italy, that is also one of the countries that saw one of the most one of the greatest developments of Encastellation, definitely because of material wealth. Italy was substantially, first of all, it had much more infrastructures that already existed from the Roman times than Northern Europe. Secondly, was wealthier than Northern Europe. So Encastellation took in this region a very peculiar characteristics that shifts even more the cause of from the second invasions to the actual patrimonial strategies of the local elites. Italy had historically speaking, a strong public authority. The Longobards had created a strong kingdom. Very few people know this. They feel that Lombards were divided and all this. Completely false. Historiography has demonstrated the exact opposite since some time. If you're gonna look into my Longobird history playlist, I discuss extensively about this in many videos, chiefly the public power in Longobird Italy and the fall of Longobird Kingdom, Longobird Italy, the path to the kingdom. So you have 3 hours, even more, of Longobird history waiting for you if you wanna, if you are interested in knowing more. And the Carolingians had actually, mm, you know, um, seized this Longobird public apparatus because it was working. They also tried to export it into the empire, but Francia was extremely different from Longobird Italy. However, as I hope all of you know, it was a Carolingian kingdom of Italy that was also decently administered in spite of all the difficulties that arose from, even in Italy, from the fragmentation of public power deriving from the Carolingian vassalic beneficiary system that had been exported also in Italy, that otherwise had up to that point a very different society from the one in France. So it kind of it had certain characteristics on its own, but it still was feudalized by the Franks in practice. And the and even in here, the bishops had a very important role, because even in here, the public power became decline, and they reorganized the defense and of the same political and economical citizen urban life by surrounding themselves with military retinues and progressively being helped themselves by the council of local citizens, usually the wealthiest and most, let's say, prestigious and appreciated ones, and influent ones that, in this sense, comforted the bishop's political action. Excuse me a drink once again. So you could argue that in this period, even the Saracen, Norman, or Magyar incursions actually contributed to the formation of what later would have become the commune. Because the commune definitely got strengthened as a pole of government during the second invasion times. First of all, because cities usually were already walled. There were areas into which there was a sort of common of government, some government assemblies already. So it was something that it was easier to move as one compared to the countryside. That was drastically fragmentating into with because of the seigneurial development, and the so there are many stories, really many powers that originated from this time. For instance, between in central northern Italy, between the regions of Emilia, Lombardy, and Tuscany. It's at this point that a great dynasty like the one of the Canossa originated. That seemingly had a very humble origin. But this really shows that where there was a local power that could give protection, stability, a certain degree of tranquility to the mess that Europe had become at that time. Well, that was that was grow that would grow because it was evidently successful. Where there was success, people would try to follow and try to keep that. Um, in this time, especially the 10th century, is a very bloody period, not just because of the second invasions, but also for continuous warfare among the Christians. However, it's still a moment that structured the local powers in a certain way that, for in the following century, especially, would have originated something greater dominions and a sort of orderly, or at least a more orderly political system than it had been in the previous centuries, and that also would have made Europe and its productive systems to rise once again and to become florid again. Another characteristics about this period of encastellation is that there was a relative scarcity of coastal centers into Europe. I mean, this was the moment in which probably Europe was, I can't say more closed in itself, because it's partially false. Here we have certain powers, definitely in Europe, that constantly interacted with the Byzantines, with the Muslims and all. But definitely, if you take the Normans and the Saracens, you understand that coastal centers weren't that safe. So you can argue that the 10th century Europe is essentially a continental Europe, with the populated countryside, with very extended forests and swampy areas, where the fluvial and lake communications were really scarce, and the terrestrial ones almost impossible. Mm. And the reasons were, as you can imagine, first of all, that the pulverization of the post-Carolingian powers and um, had caused partially also a further destructuration of what remained um, of the um, of the Roman um, road system in practice. It's not much about the Roman roads that more or less remained, at least as paths as directions, but the most important thing was about the ruining of the bridges. And bridges were very hard to repair, and at that time there were very few resources to invest in for that. So there were either very difficult or insecure fordings that could provide that minimal river crossing. It were also and especially the growth of bands of brigands that usually are very difficult to distinguish from, average brigands and the comitatus, or the so-called masnade of the warrior aristocracies that increasingly less framed into the royal institutions. So it was a very tough time. Was a lot of competition between the seigneurial powers. These armed retinues were really, devastating here and there, and adding to that destruction that was carried out by the Normans, by the Saracens, by the Magyars. Um, the the royal institutions, as we've said, were still there, uh, but when they, even if they existed formally, they were devoid, or at least very short in both in authority and in effectiveness, in terms of power, etc. So usually was the ecclesiastical lords, like bishops and abbots and lay ones, so the descendants of those families that kept or had at least seized the comital functions, and their own vassals that let's say committed themselves pretty much everywhere in Europe to establish the basis of a civil coexistence, essentially, between the communities, even as we've seen that they were partly also the reason why things were so difficult to put once again in back into place in terms of a public organization. And these aristocrats definitely had their own power in their estates, in their private estates, and from which they derived definitely also a lot of income compared to the average European inhabitant of the time. So an elite that becomes increasingly more elite. And yet we're also interested, obviously, in watchful in terms of the defense of their own territory, especially from their own neighbors and their own competitors, let's say, the other aristocrats, and they controlled those territories, as we've said, with their own military retinues. Um, the um, the let's say the progressive battering of the condition was very gradual, and the um, and it started happening somehow in the same way in terms of bettering of life conditions, both in urban centers and in the rural ones. I mean, second invasions began to run out of steam. These aristocracies had managed to build up something more something stronger in terms of local governments, etc. So there was someone who began to restore the roads, to repair the old bridges, or to build new ones. There were, let's say, also another tradition of Christian Europe since the late antique times was the building of hospices, of hostels for those who traveled. So for these wayfarers that, in spite of all the difficulties, um, were still there. You know, the Middle Ages was not a moment in which people sat all their time into their own home, or besides having to work the land every day, but there were lots of people really traveling for the most diverse reasons. There were lots of monks traveling. There were merchants still at this time. Knights traveled. Ambassadors, people, it wasn't really an idling world. It was a world that had contracted because of these problems, but that had a very strong synetic energy within itself. So we were always talking about in relative terms. I mean, the average European this time didn't travel pretty much, but still there were lots who did, and this should never be forgotten. So all these measures basically brought to the um, um, to make life circulating again in some measure within Europe. Trade had a reprisal, let's say, where there was the foundation of new markets, usually close to sanctuaries that periodically celebrated the ferie, so called in Latin, so the kind of the holidays of the from the old Roman calendar of their respective protector saints. That's the ferie is the same word from which the term fair actually comes from, so that to these centers of cult were attached business, like just it is today, with markets, with people who could buy, etc. Because these were also centers of pilgrimage, so it was evident that were people coming there from faraway places, maybe bringing some goods and or maybe needing to buy them for their own pilgrimage and all. So this is how partially the whole thing actually also how Europe revived its socio-economical tissue. Um, the There was similarly also starting from the 10th century a climatic battering, that favored mobility, demographical growth. The pilgrimage also in this sense brought to a sort of idea that people could move and could find other places to go living in. Because if you really live in the same old place, you don't know what you're surrounded by. Things that you have no scholarization, you have no, you don't know about the world you live in. But if you start moving, if you're allowed by the political and military conditions to travel, because maybe the country is safer and all, you also start to see that there are other places, and maybe you say, well, maybe I could go live in there. So there was also consequently a research of new arable lands in which to go settle. So Europe began slowly to regain to regain this ability of expanding, essentially. And castles were very important, because castles were usually the place around which these new economical activities really could develop, because it was a center of defense, so it was a lord who was checking the area, the situation, so you were protected, you felt safer. You could go work in there. and maybe if there was an enemy raid, you could run into the Lord's moat and wait for the enemy to even destroy everything you had, but still, saving your own skin. This new political and institutional system that also gravitated around castle is what today we call as feudal. And at that time it wasn't really conceived in these terms, and sometimes maybe in my videos I've never explained it, but really I talk about sometimes at the same time about the vassalic beneficiary system and the feudal system. In practice, you might say there is not a big deal difference. It's just about the terms. But usually, the vassalic beneficiary system is what you talk about, essentially from Carolingian Europe, also part of the of early medieval, or even late antique Europe, because it's not that the Franks invented the idea of having clienteles and entrusting power to so-called vassi. I made a video incidentally about exactly about this, which is about the I'll give you the title if you are interested to see where this originated. The Frankish Commendatio, at the origins of the vassalic beneficiary system. That explains that a little. While for feudal system, we talk about this essentially Frankish feudalism that began to be formalized institutionally speaking, and also culturally in many ways, and socially and all, chiefly from the 11th, 12th century, and reaching its heyday in the 13th. So what we call feudal Europe in practice. So this is really the difference, if you were wondering. Sometimes I use that interchangeably to really give an idea, because the feudal system is not something European. I mean, the feudal system is something that was used all over the world in a time or in another. It's really a common way that certain societies have to organize politically and socially their own communities. And so the thing I really care about this is really stressing the idea that in spite of the pulverization, or fragmentation, whatever you want to call it, of the public powers between the 9th and 10th century, the recovery, let's say, of the European political unity came from the above. It came came from the really from the local powers, from the low, in this sense, from below, because that was what that's where the base is laid. So necessarily, when you have something that crumbles, you have to start from the bottom. And this is how really feudal Europe was built. You have to look at these aristocracies that paradoxically had been the same ones who had fragmented public powers, and that, however, at a certain point began to rebuild them, really with a very high degree of private prerogatives, at least in their mindset, in the sense that the feudal system originated from the idea that there were certain lineage, essentially certain lineages, certain families that had gained nobility and were somehow entrusted and legitimized by their own blood. Sometimes there was a lot also of ideology attached to this, to their ethnic origins, because it was felt that the ancient nobility was something coming from the Germanic nobility, the adel. And so these people were absolutely mixed, ethnically speaking, but traditionally speaking, they cared about stressing their prerogatives as freemen, because the nobleman, in this sense, was building up the feudal system. It was building up, stressing the idea that a king, in the sense, could exist, but only if it was legitimized by the aristocracy. This is a very important concept, differently from the Roman ideal that was saying that there is a state that is entitled to rule in spite of what everybody else says. So there is a very strict, in this sense, the whole society was, let's say, revolving around the local seigneuries. That controlled the production through their estates, and that were marking quite strictly the personal bond that existed between man and man. Because the whole feudal system was based on the idea that you obey to me because first of all I am helping you, so you have to give me something in turn. And this whole thing was sanctioned by um, um, the oath of allegiance, the oath of fealty, that is at the base really of the feudal society as such in terms of cooperation. Mhm. Something very old that predates feudalism and that was present both in Germanic society and in the late Roman society, and that in this Latin Germanic Europe was evidently synthesized, let's say, um, formalized in the oath of allegiance. That was really the even the juridical base, because the oath of allegiance had a juridical value. It was like a contract. The oath of allegiance is essentially, at this time, might seem banal, but there wasn't much of written documents. I mean, this is the time in which, with the economical recovery, especially in Southern Europe, there is an extensive use of written documents and all, but especially in that completely feudal world, often illiterate in the north of Europe and etc. The idea is that even by tradition, contracts were something public that were signed, let's say, orally, just like law was oral, theoretically, from traditionally speaking. This changes because eventually Carolingian Europe also marked the rise of written culture. That is very important. Many of the peoples that had these local oral traditions were eventually feudalized, Christianized, so the littera, so the letter really as the character, was increasingly being used in the contracts, and this was expanding pretty fast in this world. Um, the so all this was kept standing for the bare necessities of defense, of needing, of providing food, of producing goods were destined to the direct consumption, because this was an extremely poor society, definitely for our standards, and the crop rates were really low. I mean, there was a very few surplus. In economy, everything was usually consumed at the moment in which it was produced. So it was a survival economy. But step by step, teeny bit by teeny bit, there was also something extra being saved and stored and sometimes put into circulation, and it is from this mechanism that progressively Europe began to expand once again in the following centuries. So the castles really have a very important role into this, because basically Europe begins to be dotted with castles at this point. They're not the castles you see today. Most of the castles of the 9th and 10th century went lost because they were simply moats made up in mud, in wood, so all organic materials perished very easily. Stone castles were something that starts to become the normality in, say, the 12th century, the 11th, 12th century, when Europe had gained the resources for affording such constructions, and those resources had been very slowly produced into these previous centuries. There were, however, certain areas, especially of Europe, where there was more material availability, into which definitely fortifications were built up in stone. This is truer in southern Europe, obviously. The or where there were already infrastructures of the Roman times. If you take the Colosseum, that made a pretty good fortification back in early medieval Rome. These are all things you have to take into consideration to see really how the progress of Europe basically worked. And usually here I've got background picture depicting more or less what a moat was like. So you had a tower, but there are also other terms. Later there is the dungeon, that starts something to be something bigger at least. There are various terms really that are used in different languages that really do not completely correspond. That are often influenced by the local historical developments. Like, however, let's say there was this central structure that you can see here. It was also the most complex one. There was essentially the lord's private abode, essentially. And here you see that it also has this extra, it's a sort of the most complex structure. It's also the one that could lodge more. It was a stock. It was a sort of warehouse in parts, and then where the agricultural, the foodstuffs were stored in practice. With surplus from the local, that derived, that was owed to the by the local peasantry to the lord for in exchange for his protection, and it was stored in there. In this sense, the lord from the castle had also a foodstuff was definitely stored for times of trouble, to which, I don't know, if this moat was besieged or you couldn't close in there, and usually the enemies raided. At this time was a big deal of siege development for these moat and bailey castles. So usually you could stay in there with your food reserves and to wait for the enemy to pillage all around and then to go away, which was often, strategically speaking, the best choice. There were, however, in this warehouse, into these seigneurial warehouses were stocked also working tools and also weapons, because the local lord was. This is something that really dates very, very back in very old times. I mean, the comitatus, also in the Germanic world, was this sort of military community, this fighting community, whose chief also owned the various weapons that were captured to the enemies and then were eventually redistributed to his own retinue. And this is how it happened there, having weapons that in this sense were taken away, by the way, from the peasantry, because the feudal system also tends to disarm the subjected community to making them to not to make them raise. At this time, peasants, by the way, weren't, as we were saying before, the real subjugation of peasant communities is something that belongs to the late Middle Ages. These times peasants were pretty active protagonists of the political and military relations in post-Carolingian Europe. They could be very dangerous. So also the lords were pretty concerned about disarming them and controlling them as much as they could to avoid revolts and all. And in this area, there was also around the lord's abode. There were, as you can partially see here, other houses that other residences that were home to the lord's retinue, essentially, and also of the rustics that were directly subjected to the lord, because even the serfs, usually the people who lived outside these fortifications, were the freemen. So those who had still a certain degree of individual contractual power, let's say, with lords, and that therefore also weren't that keen on being so closely in contact with the lord. But inside this enclosure, these fortifications, usually lived also the lord's serfs, and because of this, even of this spatial privileged place, I mean, around surrounding the lord's home, they sometimes even made career in a certain sense, because these rustics maybe were more they grew, even their families, to be more directly attached to the lord's destiny in a certain sense, and were also more in contact with them. They were often men of trust, and sometimes they were even entrusted the control of other castles that the lords started to build or to acquire. So that maybe when the original lord was wiped out, was killed, its male line went extinct and all, sometimes these rustics, so these non-freemen, these serfs, found themselves in charge of certain castles, and basically they they became lords in turn. Mm. The Viscount, for instance, is a typical title that derives from there, because um, the Viscount is really the guy who was in ruling on a certain in a certain place on behalf of the count. That was the average, let's say, post-Carolingian. The count was the lower repartition, let's say, of the Carolingian social, the Carolingian empire districtuation, and that the comital powers were usually the ones that had this, say, local district level of administration. So outside, instead, the castle, there were present other settling and productive units that were managed by characters of various rank, that could be either knights or maybe simple peasants, but they were all tied to the local lord, with a precise relation of dependence, and this could really happen with more lords at the same time, because it was that complicated. I discussed that extensively in the Carolingian Europe playlist. So this was a very complicated. Were very complicated relations that obviously it could really be played on by all the characters involved. So you have also to think of this relative instability. It's not that you were the lord of a moat and you had peasants that depended on you, and you were done. Yeah, like I can leave easily. Everything could happen. A total mess could reverse the whole thing. You could be slaughtered, your castle destroyed. So it was all in this sense, it's this metus hostilis, let's say, it's this fear of the enemy that could be either not just the Saracen or the Hungar or the Norman, but even your own, your neighbors, neighboring lords, peasant communities, maybe even the royal authority that maybe wanted to seize part of your lands and all. So it's from these precautions that eventually the feudal Europe was so well structured and so well rooted into Europe, because it had really started from the little things, like from the at a lower level. It was strongly rooted at a local level, and from there it managed to build step by step something greater. So the encastlement was this characteristic, say, uh, um, fundamental characteristic of organization of the territory between the 9th and 11th century, and it encompassed in different times and ways within the same period the whole Western Europe. Mm. So even the local circumscriptions, the so-called, you say that it should be something like Castellanies or something like that, where even these circus districts, at the center of which existed a castle, and that were built sometimes around that. Mm. So and they were part at the same time of larger juridical units that were ordered in a hierarchical dependence system that, at least in theory, had its vertex uh, um, the possessors of the local lordship, that sometimes could be also public officials, because sometimes dukes, marquises, and counts, they depended directly by the sovereign. So even if we have said that this structuration was starting from the below, still there was a lot of of dialogue throughout all the feudal hierarchy, and society wasn't that extremely complex. So in this sense, there weren't many layers, many steps for reaching, I don't know, royal authority, and it really all depended on how important you were, mm, and how powerful you were, and so the as we've seen, by the way, the dependence of the various vassals from the king was at least beyond a certain title purely formal. Mm. And the feudal system was formed by the delegation of the powers from the vertex to the base and from the center of periphery, in ways that really depended on the local equilibrium, and not really much on the nominal, let's say, order of the whole kingdom, how it had theoretically to form. Think of it. The Western Frankish kingdom, that was the place where royal authority was just a very tiny thing, even in terms of range of reach. Like southern France was a whole in another world compared to Paris, and it would remain essentially until the 13th century. So these are processes that, it's not that in the 11th century they finished. It's really how you can even trace a line from the the post-Carolingian times up to the creation of the national state, because this is how progressive really was. It took really even a millennium sometimes to be achieved in terms of territorial recomposition on a sort of national base. At this point, even national identities were really in the were really being born, really. So, um, but it's interesting how national identities, in this sense, also had partially a feudal base, because maybe I mean, think about the German expansion into the east. This is something that, well, it took really much. It's mostly something that happened into the low Middle Ages, but I mean, in there you see that the Germans expand ethnically, I mean geographically, and forming ethnic communities all over Eastern Europe, and bringing together with them feudalism. So this is very meaningful, because even certain national borders today really are based on the ancient feudal basis, because up to that point, that I don't know, that district had expanded in post-Carolingian times up to that point. So in medieval times it would remain more or less the same, maybe with some acquisitions, some losses and all. And then into the modern age that became more or less the natural border between the nations, and then eventually today it's still there. So these processes really took a great they took a lot of time, but in this sense were intensive on a local base, also because the local communities were actually very also very proud about certain lordships that ruled on them. We don't have to think about feudalism as pure oppression from our from our modern standard. It is really something that was seen also as a sort of natural society in many ways. And being subject to a prestigious lord, it's also equated to be, you know, sort of participating to that glory, to that fortune. And this is maybe a romantic interpretation, but it definitely existed in part, in spite of all the sufferings, all the oppression that definitely did exist, and that definitely increased during medieval times, and especially in the modern age. But the so in at least in theory, the feudal bonds that we have observed really permeated world society. However, we should also mention in conclusion that in practice, and especially in this early age of the Middle Ages, the personal freedom and even the free possession of goods and of lands, so they call the allodium, could still survive. So it was still recognized historically the existence um, of a freeman's space. This is how I can't find a better expression. I mean, the idea that the world society is growing feudal, with feudal oath of allegiance and personal bonds and all, but the feudal system is still based on this mutual agreement among freemen. And this is really important to bear in mind, because this is how it practically influenced the world juridical thinking in the Middle Ages, and should be understood also when you study the history of rights, you know, and you wonder how really these societies worked, even in legal, in juridical terms of justice and all. So that's very, very, very important. And when I make these videos, I always necessarily end up to be a bit schematic, in the sense that This is a purely theoretical way of looking at the thing, and if you study every single reality, you understand that everything was really unstable, was really moving. There were lots of relations that really had that complicated everything, and there was a lot, still also a lot of social mobility at this time. I mean, definitely, the feudal society was still was already crystallizing, say, from at least in compared to the previous, say, early medieval times. Yet, it was still a sort of. I mean, it was quite easy if you had a strong military retinue to found your own seigneury, to carve your own space, let's say, into this world. So this is something you see also in those lands to which feudalism really did not exist, like in the Scandinavian peoples that were only progressively structuring something more centralized. It would take them centuries, like a half of a millennium, before reaching the levels of feudal organization of the rest of Europe, but uh, substantially was a bit in the same way, and certain regions of frontier were also pretty difficult to distinguish in practice. I mean, what is really important here is the spontaneity and the fluidity of this, let's say, the spontaneity of seigneurial emergence, let's say, and the fluidity of the world system. So these until the 11th, the 12th centuries, you could still find pretty easily your time into into this system if you were, let's say, an adventurer, a good fighter, and someone who also a lucky person indeed, because lots of them died before obtaining that. But even if you see in this sense the relations that existed between the Normans and, I don't know, the French, the Western Frankish kingdom, you see that what happens is that basically Rollo as essentially a Viking got settled as a feudal lord into Normandy. Mm. And obviously, and it got the Normans got, let's say, Francicized in a very short time. So it was also very uh, um, um, a moment into which also the individual interpreting new reality was extremely important. There was a lot of bold decisions involved in this seigneurial system. But anyway, now I'm really talking too much, and for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested to receive further news about my contents. And for now, thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.